So you've started to talk about the mainstream media, which is something I wanted to ask you about, because in the past you've said some quite critical things about how poorly the media reports politics, I guess. So what's your theory? What's your criticisms?
Well, my criticisms aren't of individual journalists, because I think we've got some very good journalists in this country, but they are operating within tensions that make it very hard for them to operate effectively. We've got diminishing ownership of media that is constantly squeezing the number of journalists, the level of seniority of those journalists, and they're having to operate in an environment where people aren't buying as many newspapers, where advertising, the mainstream sort of advertising model is starting to diminish, and where we've got new media coming in, which is providing competition, and they're having to, like Duncan Garner, for instance, has to start in the morning on radio, write a blog during the day, break some news stories during the day, and then be on the 6 o'clock news and then keep going into the night possibly. So he has to be able to perform across a range of different mediums, and that's quite different to how things used to be.
Do you have any particular political journalists you respect and admire their work, or can you not comment on that sort of thing?
I've got a handful, yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
But you can't reveal your...
Oh, it's probably not a good idea, because
then,
the ones I leave out will get cross.
Okay, if they're watching.
we do, as I said, we do have some good political journalists in this country, just not enough. We don't have the diversity of it, and we don't have public broadcasting.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about, public broadcasting. I mean, I think we can probably agree that it's not in the healthiest state, especially in terms of television. So you're the broadcasting spokesperson, so what's Labor going to do about it?
Well, we're going to do something about it, and I can't announce that here today because it hasn't
okay,
policy,
well,
but we
bearing
will,
that in mind...
Labor is committed to public television broadcasting.
It didn't seem that the last government was very committed to it. So, is that going to change, do you think?
Well, I don't agree with you on saying that it wasn't committed to it. I just think that there was a lot of work to be done. There was a dual mandate for the public television broadcaster.
Which the profit one was the main one, right, for TVNZ?
Well, it was a dual mandate, so it had a charter and a commercial imperative, and there was an inherent conflict with that. And yes, it was problematic, but I think what we've got to do is come up with a new model, which is what I've been working on.
Okay, but basically you still agree with the commercial model of public broadcasting on TV?
I believe that we need a public broadcaster which includes television and radio, which is commercial free and is truly public. Okay,
so getting hints of that you might be willing to do something a bit more adventurous with television broadcasting in your policy?
I hope so.
Okay. What about Radio New Zealand? Because it seems to be pretty underfunded, even under the last Labor government. It just didn't have enough money. There was a major report done on it that showed that Labor were underfunding Radio New Zealand.
Well, Radio New Zealand has been put in a funding freeze by this current government for 5 years, which is effectively a funding cut, and is now having to try and come up with new ways to raise money. So the door to commercialisation is now being opened. We are fundamentally opposed to that. It is I suppose, the kernel of the high standard that we need to maintain.
But Labor's played a part in this, haven't they, by underfunding Radio New Zealand?
Well, I think Labor's always been committed to Radio New Zealand. I mean, you can try and criticise it, till the cows come home, but I think that Labor's commitment to it is there's a definite differentiation between National's approach and Labor's approach to Radio New Zealand.
But this was a boom time when Labor was in government, when there was lots of money to spend, and Radio New Zealand was really kept on its bare bones. I mean, it seems like Labor's commitment isn't really that much different to National's.
No, well, I absolutely disagree with you, because National have gone down the track. In fact, they would go further down the track to opening the door to commercialisation, which is something that we never did and never would do. But the moment that started to get talked about, there was a group in the community that rose up and instantly created, I think, nearly 30,000 people around a Save Radio New Zealand campaign. Now, what that tells me is while the vast majority of people might not listen to Radio New Zealand all the time, they absolutely put a value on it, and that public broadcast model and what it provides to society is absolutely critical. So, I mean, we're right there on that, and just watch the space.
I look forward to it. Okay,
and I'd like to think about the future.
Sure. Another area I'd like to try and apply a bit of heat to you is on issues of law and order, because I know that you probably see yourself as quite a liberal on issues of law and order, and probably more liberal than most of your colleagues, perhaps, I don't know. But I guess with the last Labor government, imprisonment rates pretty much doubled, which made out that it was a pretty conservative government in terms of law and order. Is that embarrassing as a Labor MP?
Not embarrassing. Embarrassing in what way?
And the fact that your party doubled the amount of people in prison.
Well, I think what we
makes
did...
you pretty socially conservative.
Well, I think what we did was ensure that people who were breaking the law got held to account. What we'd like to see is a society where we're not having as many people in prison because not so many people are committing crimes. And in order to do that, you've got to address inequality.
But Labor's response was to greatly increase how many people they saw prison as the answer to these problems.
It's not good to have it's not good to have so many people in a country in prison, and we've got one of the highest rates of imprisonment.
But it didn't happen by accident. Labor actually tightened up the laws to make it more likely that people would end up in jail. So I don't know.
Well,
I would have sensed that would be embarrassing for you, and that you wouldn't be so proud of that part.
Well, what I'd like to say to you, Bryce, is that the people that commit the worst crimes in society that should be in prison, and they should stay in prison and serve their sentences out. The people that who have a hope of rehabilitation, we should be putting a lot more emphasis on restorative justice programs and rehabilitation, and ensuring that when they come out of prison that they don't reoffend, because we've put a whole lot of stuff around them. But what you also have to do is address the causes of crime and the drivers of crime, which is inequality, and that's where, as a country, as a society, we need to be putting our energy. Okay,
so I guess on issues of inequality, likewise, I wonder what your approach is to, say, the 1980s and 1990s, where inequality did massively go up under both National and Labor. Again, is that sort of embarrassing, or do you totally defend what your colleagues did in the 80s in terms of increasing inequality?
No, I don't defend it at all. As were many New Zealanders on my side of the spectrum, didn't like a lot of the things that Labor government did, and I left New Zealand sort of in the middle of it, so I wasn't here to see the impact on our country. It was only after I came back, after Helen Clark had taken government and been in government for nearly 3 years, that I came back. And I must say, I came back to a country that, and I felt an enormous pride in coming back to a country that had a Labor government that was so progressive. Okay.
Now, I see a few questions coming in. Finn, I'll pass it over to you.
There is one on Twitter I'll ask you out in a sec, but just on the issue of inequality still, the Child Poverty Action Group had their report this week that said 1 in 4 children were in poverty. And there hasn't necessarily been a sign of either Labor or National taking up their key recommendations. Do you feel that any of those recommendations should be taken up, and also, what would your sort of silver bullet be?
I don't think there's a silver bullet to addressing child poverty.
If there was a policy that you personally, as somebody who cares about social justice, felt would be the next or the first big step, what might that be?
So dreaming a bit, maybe thinking big sky, big picture. What would you do?
Well, we've got to address child poverty. I think there's 200,000 children being estimated being in child poverty. I haven't read the recommendations from that report. I haven't had a chance. I understand it's a very big report. There's a whole lot of reports that have come out in recent months around child poverty. We have to address the issues for children in the first 3 years, the first 5 years of their lives.
Well, one of the key recommendations was that all children under 6 should have access to free 24/7 healthcare. What do you think?
I support that.
Yeah. So Labor don't seem to. So you'd push them to take on that policy.
Well, I think it's something that, you know, if we don't and can't do it straight away, we should be definitely working towards.
Okay. Any other questions out there?